Chapter 261 Reactive. Clunking clanks of rusting armor sounded in the forest, yet Jay was already concealed at the edge of the trail, as his skeletons had pre-warned and protected him. Jay was realizing that effective commanding relied not only on orders flowing down, but on information flowing up the chain of command from his scouts back to himself. Sure, from Lamp to Blue to Jay, it was a small chain of command, but a useful function on a small scale would be just as effective on a larger one, if not more so. Jay counted the incoming enemies, and he was surprised at the small response force after he had cut off the nutrient supply route. Another group of 7. I wonder if that's the optimal number. Jay gazed at the incoming soldiers from behind some large roots of a tree. 3 were in the front with 3 behind them, following along the route. Another one was at the very back, which stood out from the other 6, as it held a 2-handed sword, and unlike the others, the one at the back was the only one which was periodically looking down, checking the large flesh-like route they were all following. To Jay it seemed more animated, more intelligent compared to the others, like it retained part of what made it conscious somehow. Suddenly, contrary to Jay's expectations, the skeletons attacked. Oddly, it was not a sneak attack at all, making Jay wonder just what exactly Blue was thinking. Well, there was no warning, the skeletons didn't attack from the back. The knights easily saw them coming and readied their weapons in time, meeting the offensive with clashes of their own swords. 5 skeletons versus 7 knights, the odds were not in their favor, and as the battle started, the skeletons were quickly put on the defensive. Just what is Blue doing here? It knows better than this. Swords clashed and rattled, and Handy was the first to fall. Being lower level without armor had its drawbacks. While the skeletons had learned that weak spots of the knights was the parasite living in their spine, it was a difficult task to slip their swords between their armor, to sever their spines, especially when the knights were facing them. They couldn't reach their backs. Jay already had a mound of skeletons at his feet, green mana swirling through it as a skeleton rose from the shifting bones and assembled. Handy reanimated and sprinted back to the battle instantly, albeit without a weapon. The spectral armor of the higher-level skeletons gave them longer endurance in the fight, but it was a losing battle as the numbers were not in their favor. Red was fully focused on defense, and held the aggression of 3 knights. Their swords clanging against Red's new metal chest piece, the sword scraping and sparking across its surface as its skeletal body underneath was protected, but for how long? Sweeper was about to perish, having to deal with 2 knights now that Handy was slain. Handy was still sprinting back to battle. Blue and Lamp each dealt with 1 knight, though Lamp was coming to terms with fighting the dual-wielding knight who seemed more intelligent than the others. While the skeletons could fight on mostly equal terms with the knights, the dual-wielding knight proved to be a problem for Lamp, who had similarly unique weapons. Perhaps this was why the dual-wielding knight chose to fight Lamp. Its shepherd's crook was slapped around as if it was a child's wooden practice sword, while its gut knife was going practically no damage at all. Not only was the blade short, but even getting into range to land a hit was proving to be a monumental task. The 2-handed sword simply had too much range. The only upside was that the shorter knife made for quick parries, and having 2 weapons helped with defense. Lamp was more annoying than troublesome to the knight. The sweeping swings caused Lamp to jump back, while other times the knight rested the blade on the back of its gauntlet, and charged forward as if it were wielding a heavy spear. Clearly, it was well trained, or at least, the knight was well trained before it became infested with parasites that took over its body, and perhaps, its mind. Jay continued to watch from the sidelines, wondering if this was a fight the skeletons could win. Nothing would change if they were forced to fight a defensive battle, and Jay didn't have the mana to endlessly raise skeletons. If no knights die, then nothing will change, Jay thought, glancing at his sword, and then looking into the forest, as he found himself with 2 options. Do I fight or run, he wondered. His presence in the fight, along with the necrotic helmet and a few explosive tooth spells, would definitely create waves in the ebbs and flows of the battle, but there was one particular risk that caused a stir of fear in his heart: parasites. It was the parasites which infested the bodies of the knights. If a single one landed on Jay's flesh, he didn't know what would happen. Would they burrow into his skin, make their way into his lumbar, and begin to eat through his spinal cord? Or would it simply slide off his skin? Would he even be able to stop such a parasite once inside his body? He was not naive or wistful enough to hope that his necrotic mana would give him immunity. Parasites were a physical thing after all, and the other parasites currently residing in his arm already proved that his class wasn't a magical cure-all. Even as he thought these things, the battle continued and only convinced Jay not to join it. The swords of the skeletons were each coated in a disgusting slime-like blood, and each time a sword was pulled from the enemy's armor, a slithering mess of parasites would come with it, spattering and flying everywhere. No. If I go down, it will all be over. I don't need to be loyal to my skeletons. They will rise again, and I will not. Jay thought, I don't need to go down like the lord of a crumbling castle. It's just foolish. Yet just before Sweeper stumbled and staggered, Handy rejoined the battle, yet it didn't help Sweeper. Instead it pounced on the skeleton that Blue was fighting, wrapping its limbs around the knight and hugging its body. Jay simply watched in amazement. What is Blue planning? This one decisive moment was what Blue was counting on. It stepped between the knights, and plunged its sword into the spine of one of the three knights assaulting Red. The two-handed knight raised his helmet, glancing around. One of these undead came back while one of its knights had perished. It knew something was wrong. This chapter's initial release occurred on the N0vel BJJN site. Next, Sweeper crumbled, the second skeleton to fall, yet the two-handed swordsman kept its head raised, analyzing the battle. It seemed to be calculating as it looked around, becoming more defensive in its fight with Lamp. Red was now facing two knights, yet Blue was now joining it, making it a 2-on-2 fight, and using its new armor, it would be able to shrug off a few hits, while getting its sword close to the enemy's spine. Out of all the skeletons, Red was the most proficient in killing these types of enemies, and was the only skeleton to have won a one-on-one fight thus far. In a few moments, Red managed to take another knight down, but before it could take another with it, reinforcements came. The knights that had destroyed Sweeper swarmed over, locking Blue and Red into a 2 versus 3, though Handy was about to fall again, and it would soon be a 2 versus 4, locking them into another losing defensive battle of attrition. Jay quickly resummoned Sweeper and sent it back to the fight, yet he couldn't help but wonder why the intelligent two-handed knight was not dominating and destroying Lamp. The normal knights can go even with a skeleton, so surely it can destroy Lamp whenever it pleases. He thought, but Jay soon had his answer. As Sweeper ran from Jay's position, the two-handed knight's visor looked up, and Jay could tell it was staring right at him, seeing his head poking from behind a tree. Its focused eyes locked onto Jay's position as it released a powerful swing with its sword, causing Lamp to jump back, yet it didn't continue the engagement. Instead, it sprinted towards Jay. Fuck. Chapter 262 Pierced. Jay stood up. After crouching behind the tree, his position was discovered. There was no point in hiding, so he prepared to fight. The two-hander knight was charging to Jay, while Sweeper was sprinting towards it, intercepting the enemy. The knight had a target though, and it wasn't going to let some measly skeleton stop it. Holding its sword with one hand, it rested the blade on the back of its gauntlet and continued its charge, forcing Sweeper to either dodge or die. Sweeper naturally sidestepped to dodge the hulking armored enemy, slashing at it as passed by, though no real damage was done as its sword scraped armor. Immediately, Jay released a wall of bones from his gauntlet, and a white barrier was made between himself and the knight. Unfortunately, it really was just a pile of bones. It had no structural stability or any real protection, and was tall as it was wide. It was more like a mound than a wall. Jay readied a spear from behind the barrier. Sweeper followed the knight from behind, but the knight had kept its momentum and charged right into the makeshift barrier of bones. With a crash, bones split and cracked as its unstoppable heavy armor smashed into the bone wall, and Jay was surprised at how flimsy his barrier truly was. At the very most, it slowed some of the knight's momentum. Jay planted the base of his bone spear into a gap between the roots, bracing it while aiming the tip at the rampaging knight. The knight had no time to react. The spear's tip found a catch in the armor, fixing itself in place before snapping under the force of the knight. The knight stumbled and slowed down. Caught off guard for a moment, it couldn't see what was on the other side of the wall, before it charged right through it, relying on its metal armor to protect its body. Yet even as it stumbled, it brought down a heavy cut towards Jay's head. Jay stepped back as the spear snapped, and brought an Asane sword out to meet the already descending swing of the enemy's two-handed sword. The ethereal helmet let out a necrotic bolt, but as it met the enemy's armor, it burst into a harmless glowing cloud of mana. Jay's gauntlet hand was free, and he didn't have his Deathwalker's sentry shield out for one reason. Uncaring rip. He reached his gauntlet out as if grasping for his enemy's soul, yet the bone pulled was not enough to execute. The bone that was ripped out was somewhere in the chest, and if Jay had to guess, it was part of the rib cage. Though it didn't exit the armor, it was clad inside, perhaps for the best, as there was the risk of parasites spraying out. The knight didn't feel any pain at all as it continued to pull down its heavy sword. At the same time, Jay's bone sword deflected the two-hander from crushing his head, but it landed on his unarmored shoulder instead. Jay dropped his own sword to the ground. GRRH. Jay gritted his teeth in defiance as he reached up and pushed it off of his shoulder with his necrotic gauntlet, but something was wrong. His arm was still attached. Well, not wrong, but peculiar. To Jay's and the knight's surprise, there was no damage. An ethereal parasite tail had appeared and flashed a necrotic green as it met the sword just above its master's precious flesh. The helmet's sentinel form was working perfectly. Since the helmet had absorbed the damage, the sword didn't sever his arm completely. In fact, as Jay pushed it off, there was no pain at all. Sweeper finally caught up and pounced on the intelligent knight from behind. Unfortunately, Sweeper hadn't yet reclaimed its weapon, and was only like an annoying pest, as it clung to the knight's limbs, and could only use its natural claws to rend through whatever gaps it could find. The knight ignored the skeleton on its back and focused wholly on J.N0V3LTR0V served as the original host for this chapter's release on N0V3 liters B1N. The wide sweeping swing of the rustic two-handed sword caused a waving noise in the air as it closed in on Jay. Its two armor-clad arms were working at full force as its whole body leaned backwards, and Jay doubted his helmet would be able to take another hit. Whoosh. Boong. The blade was met with a solid block. Deathwalker's sentry appeared just in time as it materialized in Jay's grip, though Jay was knocked away from his fallen sword. Next, a dagger appeared in his other hand, but it wasn't a bone dagger. It was one of the defensive spikes that Sweeper had previously crafted, and it was Sweeper who Jay tossed it to. Sweeper scrambled to the ground to get the bone spike, while Jay Spartan kicked the enemy to get some distance. It staggered back, and before it could swing again, Jay picked his sword up from the ground. The enemy readjusted itself and checked its back, knowing that Sweeper could now pose a threat, yet Jay took this slight moment to step forward, and plunged his sword into its neck. It pierced deeply with a sponging squelch, but it missed the spine, if only by a few centimeters. The knight seemed to grunt, still having the use of its vocal cords. Jay was too close for it to make use of its long weapon. Normally getting this close would be a good strategy. Unfortunately, Jay had acted far too brashly, and forgot about one crucial threat on his enemy. The knight held its sword with one hand, and its free hand was now flying right towards Jay's stomach. Fuck! Jay's eyes widened. Immediately he recalled how Lamp had parasites and eggs pumped into its skin suit when that enemy pierced his stomach. Jay stared in shock, and time seemed to slow down. If that pierced his stomach and sent eggs into his body, it would be all over. Even if he won this fight, his life was forfeit, and all that would await him would be an excruciating death. Boom. A necrotic bolt appeared from the ethereal jaws of the helmet, but the blast of necrotic energy met the knight's armor, dissipating into wisps of the sickly green mana on either side of the knight's arm. Its magic had no effect on the armor. The helmet's ethereal body was not yet long enough to protect Jay's stomach either. It's over. The knight's hand landed on Jay's stomach. Oof. Jay curled forward, the blow sending the air out of his lungs, yet he smiled. Jay couldn't help but feel as if he just dodged a date with death. To his own shock, there was no blood, no wound. The knight had curled its gauntlet into a fist at the last second as it slammed it into Jay. It punched me. Jay almost chuckled, completely distracted from the fight. The knight continued its assault and returned a Spartan kick to Jay, finally getting enough distance to use its long weapon again. Yet Sweeper was already back on it, piercing its back with a crude bone spike, its jagged edges ripping through whatever it touched. The knight was hoping to score a devastating blow on Jay while his guard was down, but instead had to deal with Sweeper. With a backwards kick, it pushed Sweeper away. Since the knight punched Jay, he had figured something out, and this distraction by Sweeper was all Jay needed. Holding his shield with two hands, Jay faced it forward and leaned down as if he were about to brace before a tidal wave. Iskian. Two jets of air burst from the soles of Jay's boots, sending him flying forwards. Needless to say, the knight was caught completely off guard. Jay was simply too fast. The shield slammed against its chest and sent it toppling over with a loud clang. Jay's first magic-infused shield bash was a resounding success as the knight was knocked on its back. Despite holding the shield with two hands, Jay still had to push his shoulder up against it from the force of the blow. While it was still alive, the knight was as good as defeated now. Not only did it take effort to pick his heavy armor off the ground, but now there was a person on top of him. Before it could punch or harm Jay in any meaningful way, Sweeper was already there, ripping its helmet off and relentlessly stabbing into its neck. Jay no longer feared its egg-laying attack. Why? Because he realized this knight in particular didn't have that capability. Jay pulled himself up, though he kept a foot planted firmly on the knight's chest plate as he watched it struggle pitifully to the bitter end. Sweeper offered no remorse, no mercy, no quarter. Jay stared without expression or pity. The knight's head was different compared to the others he had seen. Its eyes weren't sunken. Jay made a mental note to do a small autopsy later. The fight was over, but the battle was not. Finally, Jay could survey the battlefield once more. Swiveling his head around, he made a quick note of what all the skeletons were doing. Lamp had initially been fighting the intelligent two-handed swordsman knight, but Blue had pulled it back into the other battle. Jay was going to be angry as he was in trouble at the time, but after a moment he realized it was the optimal tactical decision. Blue, Red and Lamp were fighting 4 knights. While Red could hold off 2 of them, Blue could not. If Blue went down, then soon Red would fall to a group of 4 enemies. After that, Jay would have to deal with 4 extra knights, and at the time, he was dealing with a two-handed intelligent knight. As for Handy, well, it was still dead. Yet with Lamp there, Blue was able to fight only 1, and using Lamp's unique weapons, Blue was able to do some more maneuvers to move behind the knights and slay them. It was only a matter of time before they were all slain. As reliable as ever, Jay smiled with a nod, praising Blue. With all the knights dead, he let the skeletons feast to their heart's content, munching on the bone barrier he had summoned. Jay watched over them as they consumed before him, and he allowed the helminth off his body, so it could heal itself. The amulet that was the parasite's body had a crack, but after it had some time to regenerate in its natural form of bones and spines, it was back to normal. Fully healed, it rested back onto Jay's shoulders in its ethereal sentinel form, its physical body compacting back into the amulet again. Seeing that everything was in order, Jay let out a relaxed sigh, giving himself a moment to think after the battle, though here he summoned Handy and let it join the others, soon reclaiming its weapon. While the battle went well, one thing was a cause for concern. The one intelligent enemy had charged at Jay directly, realizing quickly that Jay was the source of the undead skeletons. One intelligent enemy was bad, but what if there were more of these smart enemies? Well, Jay would just have to adapt, and he already had a few ideas in mind, but for now there were other priorities. Jay opened his exp notification, once again pleased with his bounty. 805 exp. Jay still had to loot his enemies too, but even if there was nothing, just getting this exp was reward enough. However, there were a few other things to do first. Glancing at the body of the intelligent knight, he wondered what made it so different from the others. In the mind of Jay, learning his enemy's weaknesses was more important than getting a few pieces of armor anyway. Time for an autopsy, he thought, standing over its corpse. Chapter 263 Test 2. Jay began the autopsy of the intelligent two-handed swordsman knight. Sweeper had already ripped its helmet off as it frantically stabbed its neck, and seeing what was underneath had made Jay curious. The head did not have sunken eyes, and the flesh was not gray and decaying. If anything, the enemy looked quite healthy, having plump cheeks, though they were not rosy, but a pale green color. His blood had since been replaced by whatever green fluid sustained these creatures. Jay believed they could even speak and communicate to some degree, as these knights, apparently, had a deal with the cannibals. During the fight, Jay had planned to use his analyze skill on one, though there was either no time or they were too far away. The head's nearly removed anyway, so we might as well pop it off. Jay stepped back, out of the firing range of stray fluids. Remove the head, he ordered, not interested in doing the dirty work himself, and why would he when he has underlings? As the head came off, Jay noticed there was still a centipede-like parasite residing in the spine, but it appeared much thicker. Pull it out. Handy lightly grabbed the creature from the decapitated head of the knight, and Jay's interest was piqued. I see, unlike the other knights, the parasite is the right way up. That's probably why there's still blood flow to the human's head. Well, nutrient flow. Jay scratched his chin. Probably why the knight was smarter too. The parasite must be able to use its brain somehow. I bet this one could speak too. Jay had noticed a few other details about this knight too. There was no wriggling parasites in its blood, and after further investigation he found there were no eggs in its lungs either. While its body contained the same parasite, it was used for different purposes. The other knights must have been like egg storage or breeders. Their spinal parasites are upside down, so they can focus on and tend to the eggs in the abdomen, before spreading them to others. This intelligent knight must be more of a protector, a fighter, or a thinker. Jay pondered. I suppose that's also why it could use 2 hands. Its other arm hasn't been morphed into a delicate egg implanting tube. Jay patted his stomach, reassuring himself that there was no broken skin. It's probably not as smart as a human though. I mean, it wouldn't take a genius to figure out that the source of the skeletons is me, so it's no wonder it went for me. I just need to be more careful. Maybe it's time I put that mass summoning skill to use. The skill Jay was speaking about was the skill which allowed him to leave a physical pool of necrotic mana within a pile of bones. Skeletons would endlessly raise from it, as long as either the bones or mana didn't run out. He could simply set and forget it while hiding in another part of the forest. Jay also had the option of simply having the skeletons run away from his location before rejoining the battle, but while an elegantly simple solution, Jay desired to test this new ability. Looking around, Jay first decided to loot the corpses. However, Blue interrupted him again. Blue stood in front of him and pointed deeper into the safety of the forest. "Oh, not now." Jay frowned. Blue pointed further into the forest again, and in a few moments Jay heard the familiar sounds of clunking armor. "Ah, I'll loot them later." Jay quickly gathered the bones around and waved his hand over the intelligent knight's corpse, looting it without looking at what he got as he walked deeper into the forest. So this must be why Blue had the skeletons all attack as quickly as possible. Instead of getting into a sneak attack position, there were more coming. Damn it. At the start of the fight with the 7 knights they had since slain, Blue had all the skeletons instantly attack, and Jay had been wondering why until now. It turns out that Lamp had scouted the first batch of 7 knights coming, but following them were a second group, and by the sounds of the armor, a larger one. The skeletons lined up at the edge of the tree line, this time preparing for an ambush. Yet as Jay looked along the route they had been following, he soon saw the group of enemies. 10 knights, 2 of them intelligent. A bit too much to handle, at least without too much risk, Jay thought. Blue had prepared an ambush for them this time, but seeing how many there were, Jay decided to take command. "Fall back. They'll go on guard once they find their comrades' dead bodies, and the sneak attack will fail. We'll just have to wait and see what they do. Plus, there are other tactics we can try." When giving the order, Jay explained part of his reasoning, not sure if Blue had realized that the ambush wouldn't be too successful. Nevertheless, Blue accepted Jay's orders without hesitation like it always did, and the skeletons all slipped deeper into the forest before the knights came too close. Jay made sure to keep himself much deeper in the forest this time, only barely seeing the dead knights through the gaps between the trees. As the knights entered the area, they suddenly stopped marching as they saw the corpses, and readied their weapons before assembling themselves into a semicircle formation. 2 intelligent variants at the back moved to the front of the formation. First they inspected the surroundings, but seeing the quiet forest they began to check the corpses. One was using another 2-handed sword, while the other wielded a sword and shield. The shield had symbols on it for the number 2, and were faded to a light blue color, but other than that, Jay couldn't make out much else because of its heavy rust. While Jay had the option to run, it would have made things harder in the long term for a few reasons. If any of the knights made it back to their army, all of the knights would be alert and had their defenses ready. They would also realizing that 7 knights were not enough to win, meaning that Jay would have to fight larger groups of enemies. They had already sent 2 groups of knights, 17 in total, to investigate, but it was hard to determine how many were waiting deeper in the knight territory. Jay assumed that they were sent in 2 different groups, as the first 7 gathered much more quickly than the second group of 10, or perhaps it was merely a scouting or vanguard force. Maybe the group of 10 were there to restore the underground corpse-eating plants, while the first 7 were the guards. Either way, Jay couldn't be sure, and neither did it matter very much. All he was sure of was that they had to die, and he would not let them return to the knight headquarters. Jay quickly sent Lamp to scout, seeing if there were more groups of knights coming or not, and he knew Blue would warn him if there was, if Lamp found any. In the meantime, he positioned the rest of his skeletons on the other side of the knights, the opposite side of the forest. All skeletons left except Red, who he kept as protection. While waiting for them to get into position, he devised a new tactic for the skeletons to use. "Blue, send Handy out of hiding and make sure the knights see before having Handy run back to you. Ambush the ones that come to investigate without the other knights seeing you slay them. If all the knights follow Handy, go deeper into the forest and remain hidden, then try again." It was a simple tactic, using Handy as bait to lure a handful of knights to their deaths, and Jay wasn't sure if they would fall for it. Naturally, a commander would send a scout or 2 to investigate, or at least that was what Jay thought he would do if the situation was reversed. Jay hid with Red on the opposite side of the knights, as he waited for the plan to go into action. 8 of the knights were in a semicircle formation, while the 2 intelligent ones were still investigating the corpses of their kin. They had not found the intelligent knight's corpse yet, so perhaps they were hoping it would come back and report what had happened eventually. After all, this group of 10 knights were only marching about 10 to 20 minutes behind. Surely their brethren weren't decimated that quickly. Surely some would still be alive. Suddenly there was movement on the edge of the forest. Ashen white sticks all mixed and moving together as one with a large white dome. A skeleton had appeared. Of course, the parasites had seen nothing like it. Chapter 264 Colony's Gambit. A skeleton appeared. What is that? Neither of the parasites had seen anything like it, though they felt a sense of fear coming from the human brain they held captive. It would have shocked any human at least, but to these parasite-infested knights, it was just an odd enemy. If it was a human, perhaps they would talk with it, though this weak-looking creature was, in the grand scheme of things, nothing but a strange pest. The small skeleton was not a threat to them, but possibly a threat to their food source. The humans which they farmed. The two intelligent knights glanced at each other for a moment before deciding what to do. One walked over to two of the lesser knights, tapping them on the shoulder and sending them after it. Only two. Jay smirked. A devilish grin grew on his face as he watched from the other side of the forest, knowing those two lesser knights were marching to their deaths. They were now chasing Handy away from the safety of their group, and Handy was successfully running slowly without being obvious about it. It turned out that a slow-moving skeleton, somehow, seemed quite natural despite itself being an unnatural abomination, a mockery of both life and death. Being underestimated was almost as important as the element of surprise. Handy soon disappeared into the forest, and the two knights following it did too. The two intelligent knights, which functioned as officers or commanders, went back to analyzing the corpses and seemed completely uninterested, neither of them reckoning the trap that was closing around them. Handy led the knights past Blue, Sweeper, Lamp, who cut them off from behind, sealing their fate. Neither was able to lift their sword in defense or attack as both fell, and it wasn't long until Jay received some notifications. 115, exp 115 exp. 2 down. The remaining 8 knights didn't move, none of them responding to their fallen comrades, and it gave Jay a clue. So their communication isn't telepathic, or at least it's very short range. Jay squinted, remembering how Villator used to speak into his mind. Or it could be something that I can't comprehend at all. The two intelligent knights had finished their investigation, and seeing that they were not under attack, they decided to send the other 6 knights to begin scouting the nearby surrounding forest. Unfortunately, they were not sent to scout very far, and were still within view distance of at least one other knight, and if the skeletons tried to assassinate one, the others would all know. What to do, Jay thought, but he soon realized he didn't have much time left to think. It would only be a matter of time before they found the corpse of the intelligent knight, and then there would be no telling what the knights would do after. Would they panic and send for help? Call for reinforcements? He could not let that happen. I have to act. Jay nodded resolutely, his hand forced. Each of you pick a separate target and get ready to assassinate. Wait for my signal. Jay ordered, and the skeletons moved. Red was sent to find an enemy too, as he needed to kill as many as possible before they went on alert. With Blue, Red, Sweeper and Lamp, Jay believed 4 knights would soon fall. Handy was part of the attack too, and they proved to be successful, but Jay wasn't counting on it. It was still level 3, and wielding a 2-handed sword to assassinate an enemy was no easy task. Yet if 4 knights went down, it would be enough. The enemy forces would only have 4 on their side, with 2 being of the intelligent variety. The skeletons took some time to get into position, and it was no easy task to remain hidden, as the knights were all looking into the forest and scouting while this was happening. However, there was a problem. One of the scouting knights were now walking directly to the slain intelligent knight's corpse. Shit, Jay thought, sensing his skeletons were not ready. Of the 5 skeletons at his disposal, only 3 were in position to assassinate. Handy and Sweeper were still navigating around the forest, trying to remain hidden while doing so. Come on, Jay could only clench his fists. But it was too late. The lesser knight had stumbled across the corpse, and already called an intelligent one over. He had to give the signal, or maybe he wouldn't be able to pick any off. It was a few steps from seeing its fallen comrade, but before that could happen, Jay gave the order. Do it, then collapse on them. Without warning, 3 heavy clunks of armor simultaneously hit the ground, making all the others turn to see. 115, X-Bax 3. Yet for one of them, turning its back to the forest was the most foolish thing it could have done. 115, X. Well, it didn't go according to plan. The results were the same. Only 4 knights remained as the skeletons swarmed from the forest. The two intelligent knights realized their mistake. Not only had their two scouts died, but there was an enemy with overwhelming force capable of slaying them, and now they didn't even have numbers on their side. Yet all hope was not lost. The knights nodded at each other and ran back to the middle, getting into a defensive formation before any more could be picked off. However, Jay was pleased with this decision. Only a matter of time, then. Jay smiled, yet his grin soon disappeared. The four knights looked around, and found that the enemy numbers were, well, not that numerous. The skeletons surrounded them, 5 versus 4, though there was currently no way to get at the spine of the knights. It would only be a matter of time. However, the knights were not going to let this become a losing battle of attrition. Suddenly one of the knights pushed the other one in the back, giving it the momentum to instantly send it running. The intelligent sword shield wielding knight shot out, bashing away a stray swing with his shield, and escaping the skeleton formation. It was determined, and based on its direction it was going back to its nest, or whatever these things had for a home, undoubtedly to warn its brethren. Fuck. Jay pursed his lips. He had to stop it at all costs, yet only send Handy after it. He could tell that the other knight was looking for an escape too, so having the other skeletons guard them was a necessity. The problem was that Handy couldn't catch it by itself. It was fast, but could only hinder its movement. While his bone helmet had an ensnare ability, which would snare it for a second, there was no way it would be able to enter the earth through the tangled web of roots below. Jay was left with only one option: to chase it himself. Jumping from cover, Jay stashed his sword and shield in his inventory, and began dashing across the root-covered forest, making sure he didn't trip while nimbly stepping over each root. Without all the heavy armor, Jay was faster. Still was Handy. It was already wildly swinging its two-handed sword down on the knight's back, being met with the cling of the heavy armor in return. Aim for the back of its knees, Jay ordered to Handy, though it was easier said than done, and the knight was not slowing down. Jay sprinted, flying across the roots with all the speed his legs could give him. I can't let it escape. I can't let it fucking escape, he grit his teeth. If the parasite-infested knights knew of his presence in this dungeon, it would make things immeasurably harder. What would be a few days would turn into weeks, and in this dungeon with mass starvation and parasites, who knows how long until the food would run out. Jay only had a few days of food in the first place, and the villages would only last so long before everything would be covered in these creeping roots. Not to mention the 2 weeks here would result in nearly 1.5 days passing in the real world, and there was no telling if the mage hunters would catch up to him by then. Plus, Heavy was still guarding Azra outside the dungeon. Would she even bother to wait for Jay? He still had her blood-fueled compass, so at least it would keep her around for a while, but what of her wrath? As Jay ran, he completely ignored the fight which broke out between the 4 skeletons and the 3 knights behind him. The one intelligent knight was effectively using its two-handed sword and covering the backs of its kin, locking them all into a drawn-out struggle, buying as much time as possible for the escapee. Jay was closing in on the armored knight, but as he neared the back of its hulking armor, he wondered how he would stop it. Do I try to pull it back and slow it down, or push it, sending it toppling forwards and face-planting? A nudge forward would only serve to speed it up, so it would have to be powerful. The initial instance of this chapter being available happened at M0v3 Elbin. Jay dismissed the option of sending his sword into its spine. He did not have the practice that the skeletons did with pushing it through the armor gaps. From Jay's perspective, it seemed like an unstoppable steel-skinned bull. A lot of force would be needed just to either knock it over or slow it down. When Jay was close enough to try something, he was already out of earshot from the fight he left behind. Despite its heavy armor, it had already covered a lot of ground through the forest. Damn it, it won't be long until we run into more knights. Jay clenched his jaw and stuck to his tail. Thinking through all of his skills and options, he made a quick decision. I'll have to use the boots again, but will it be enough? Chapter 265 Last Chance. The locked dungeon was dangerous for one reason. You could not leave it until it was finished. Its only benefit to his captives was that time would flow more quickly in the dungeon, at least in this case anyway. Jay was completing it quickly. However, if this one night slipped away, it would not only affect how quickly he could complete the dungeon, but would affect his life in the real world too. The night posed more danger to Jay than it would ever realize. The armored knight in front of him was heavily stomping each step like a nail in Jay's coffin. Handy was battering its smaller two-handed sword behind the knight's knees, but it was never finding the right spot as its legs moved too quickly. Jay stored his weapons and shield in his inventory so he could focus on running, and while he planned to use his magic boots for another shield bash, he first pulled out a bone spear. He stabbed the back armor of the knight, trying to send it toppling forwards, harassing it madly with numerous strikes. The knight quick adapted and leaned backwards. Jay was only helping it run. Damn it, he grunted. Jay didn't want to use his makeshift shield bash technique, as if he missed it, it would only create a bigger problem, as he would slam into a tree or miss completely. Yet as the shield was brought out, the knight suddenly turned. Placing the pommel of his sword against a tree, it slowed its momentum and swung its shield back. Jay smashed heavily against the knight's shield, Deathwalker's sentry pressing firmly back against it, only just raised in time. He was not expecting this sudden change in behavior. The knight's arm gave way to Jay's impact, and only its armor stopped it from being irreversibly damaged. Being this close to each other, the knight thrust his sword. GRRH. Jay's abdomen offered little restraint against the sword piercing it, and the helmet was protecting his neck area, unable to block in time. -5. All he could do was grit his teeth as he reeled from the attack, trying to regain his balance. Thankfully these were only level 4 enemies, and not much damage could be done at least to Jay's hit points. Another swing came, but Deathwalker's sentry braced the hit a critical block, no damage. Deathwalker's sentry caused mana burn, but it seemed that these parasites were not magical creatures at all, as the knight readied for another slash. Jay caught his balance though, and returned his own sword. Sending it to the neck area, it returned with a green stain. Handy was still with Jay and was still slashing and stabbing at the area behind the knight's knees. Now that the knight had stopped, it only made it easier for Handy, and its sword was painted by the green blood too. The knight realized the situation was desperate, and it made a desperate move. In one movement it smashed its shield against Jay and swung its sword back. It pushed away from the tree, returning to a mat and dash again, sprinting towards its army. No. Jay growled, angry at how much pressure this single enemy was putting on him. Tossing his shield to the ground, he lunged desperately with his sword. The sword struck the armor harmlessly, but Jay's free hand found placement, grabbing the armor by the neck. The knight couldn't run with the extra weight tugging on it, and Jay gave up all defense as he stabbed. Handy positioned itself in front of the knight, but was ignored as the knight spun around, having to deal with Jay. Jay's sword made a gap in the armor, but couldn't sever the spine before he lost his grip as the enemy turned to face him. Instead of taking a shield bash or sword stab, Jay stayed close. He did the unexpected and grabbed the knight closely, hugging it as if a broken boxer or a long-lost friend. The knight pulled his sword back to pierce the foe mindlessly clinging to his chest. Iskian. A blast of wind suddenly pulsed outwards, sending the knight backwards. Jay was spared, while the back of the knight was fated to meet the blade of Handy's two-handed sword. Jay had used his magic boots again. With a gap in the armor, all that needed to be done was to sever the spine, and that's precisely where Handy was aiming. With one decisive movement the sword pierced the spine, and just like that the fight was over. The knight's body continued to fall backwards, crushing into Handy, who received broken bones from the added weight of Jay on top of both of them. 115 X. Bastard, Jay said, standing up. Waving his hand over the corpse, he got another loot notification, though he still had not read the other one he had from earlier, and 2 pieces of loot were now waiting for him. Jay helped Handy from under the corpse, and sent it to pick up his shield before heading back to his other minions. It was easy to find the way back as he simply had to follow the thick flesh-like route. Jay had left this group of 3 knights surrounded by 4 trusty skeletons. The initial instance of this chapter being available happened at N0v3 Elbin. It was enough to hold them off and to kill them, but it seems that Blue decided to wait until Jay got back before trying to slay them. Battles could be hazardous, random, and sometimes the unexpected happened, and it seemed that Blue was not willing to risk another night escape while its master was gone. Sure, there was some fighting, but it was always defensive on the side of the skeletons, as they kept the trio of knight hemmed in from all sides. As there was an intelligent knight among them, it helped to keep the other 2 lesser knights in a defensive formation. Not only were they effectively covering each other's backs, but the intelligent knight was a better fighter too. Those Jay returned to the area, all hell broke loose. Master was back, so it was time to attack. The intelligent knight was slain first. Blue and Red each recklessly charged into a confrontation with the intelligent knight. Sweeper and Lamp each took the attention of the other 2 lesser knights. The reckless wide swing was met with a resounding clunk of Red's metal chest piece, and Blue was spared from damage as it dashed behind the knight, plunging its sword mercilessly into the armor, wiggling it around without care. 115 X. Blue and red each moved onto the back of the other two knights, repeating the same steps. The last two fell without incident. 230 X. Bam, I kinda wanted to analyze one of them. Never thought I'd complain about killing enemies too quickly. Jay shook his head at himself, but a hint of a smile appeared on his lips. It was over so quickly it was almost like it was rehearsed. After their bodies fell and their heavy armors went silent, silence finally returned to the forest. Jay stood silently for a moment, glad that the battle was over. As he looked over all the dead knights around him, part of him thought he would feel glory or even shout for joy, but ultimately he just felt empty. While it made him stronger, there was something so senseless about it. In the grand scheme of things, these were simply parasites trying to survive, and I am just here to eradicate them. He nodded. Loot everything. Use it if you need it or bring it to me. The skeletons checked over all the dead bodies, looting 15 in total which hadn't been looted yet. Jay checked the loot he received from the two intelligent knights he himself had slain. Squire's knee guards. Common. 3 armor. He held them in his hands. It counts as 1 item. Good, I suppose. Odd but good. Squire's gauntlet. Common. 10 armor. Another one for Blue then. Jay shrugged, then glanced up at his skeletons. Or not. Blue had found another gauntlet. Not only that, it had some upper leg armor now too. It seems they were designed with the knee guards in mind as it ended just above the knee, so Jay decided to gift it to knee guards too. Without all the rust, the armor was a dark gray with a soft silvery luster on its surface. Jay decided not to give too much thought to why the looted armor wasn't the same rusted junk the knights were wearing, as it seemed almost brand new. As for the other skeletons, Sweeper found a chest piece complete with shoulder guards, while Red received a shield, gifted to it by Lamp. Lamp also gifted a gauntlet to Sweeper, and it seemed that Lamp wasn't too fond of wearing armor. Probably gets in the way of its skin suit, Jay guessed, glancing at it. It seemed that Lamp was comfortable wearing clothes though, no matter how tattered they were, so Jay was glad for that at least. With the spare gauntlet from Jay, Sweeper now had 2 gauntlets. Red, show me your shield. Red was already at Jay's side. His trusted bodyguard never strayed too far unless ordered to, and it held its new shield up for Jay to look at. The shield was a kite shape, but Jay was more intrigued by the decoration on it. The two symbols were milky white with a blue background. Around the outside of the shield was a jagged brown pattern. From 2 what? Jay raised a brow. It didn't mean anything to him. Neither did the brown pattern surrounding it, which may as well have been rusted away like it was on the knight's shield. After feeding more bones to his minions, it was time to leave, yet one of the skeletons had leveled up. Since all of the other skeletons were level 4, Handy had gained all of the unsearchable skeleton X. Of course Jay was in a rush, but for this he would take a moment, selecting his skeleton's new role. As for its new role, well, Jay had been grooming it for this role since it was level 1. Congrats Handy, Jay smiled warmly. Author note. Challenge. 3k power stones by end of week equals 5 bonus chapters. Plus 1 bonus chapter for every 500 PS over 3k. Plus 2 is Roman numerals for 2. Also, let's do an armor check for the skeletons currently with Jay. Red. Metal. Chest shoulders. 2 gauntlets. Shield. Bone. 2 greaves vambraces. Helmet. Same for all other skeletons except for Handy. Blue. Metal. 2 gauntlets. CUISSES metal pants. Knee guards, also called the pollen. Sweeper. Metal. Chest shoulders. 2 gauntlets. Handy has neither bone nor metal armor. Just a modified Asane sword made into a 2-hander. Author is going away for a week. Has laptop so will still write and upload chapters when possible. Star. Chapter 266 Warfare. Handy had finally leveled up. It was a skeleton Jay had been training into his Wayhander since it was created, and Jay had kept it from touching anything that wasn't a 2-handed sword, when he practically could anyway. Yet the classes available only revealed more secrets. Germinating skeleton level 4 Handy. Type undead. Role unclear. HP 55 55ths. MP 10 tenths. Skills. Bone Eater. Scrimshaw level 1, passive. Undeath, passive. Fear, weak, passive. Shade Vision, passive. Description. An abomination, its existence spits in the face of life and death, and they spit back. Stop it before it's too late. Execute with extreme prejudice. Burn the bones. Evolution available. Please choose a role from available categories. Available categories are based on the skeleton's qualitative experience. If no choice is made, a random role will be assigned once the skeleton levels up. Commander, 1. Guard, 1. False Hope, 1. Rear Guard, 1. Zweihander. Warrior. Champion. Jay saw the option he wanted, the Zweihander, but now there was a new role he hadn't seen. The champion role. Champion, huh? Jay scratched his chin, thinking for a moment. Jay only knew about the Zweihander role because Red once had the option, but now there was the champion role. While Red wasn't trained specifically to be a Zweihander, it did have the role available. Since Handy was trained specifically for it, it obviously got the role, but now there's a new role. I'm guessing it's an even more specialized role. Since Zweihander was available to a skeleton which only used a two-handed weapon a few times, the champion role unlocked for a skeleton which did nothing but use a two-handed weapon. It was logical of Jay to assume that the champion role was therefore more accustomed to fighting with, solely, a two-handed weapon. It was far too intriguing, and Jay's choice was obvious. Champion is simply too rare to pass up. He nodded, locking in the choice. Handy was now the same level in height as the other level 4 skeletons now, and before Jay could start his march, Handy was wanting more bones undoubtedly to upgrade its weapon. I suppose we have some time. Jay pursed his lips and sat down. It will be better to do it before the fight ahead anyway. Handy used Jay's sword as a base as more bones were added around its outside and molded into it. Instead of doing it all at once, it did it at smaller intervals along the sword, allowing it to create a fairly high-quality product, higher than what should be possible with its level 1 scrimshaw skill. Jay watched it as he ate a snack and drank some of his water, reminding himself to do that with his next crafts. While on his journey in the outside world, Jay had not been idle himself, and had been continually crafting, melting and recrafting bone daggers, while he was carried along on his pseudo-throne. Kamal level 4. Might be a good idea to get dark in here, otherwise the skeleton exp might go to waste. The initial posting of this chapter occurred via N0V3LB11N. Heavy was an option too, but Jay needed it to stay with Azra. While exp for Jay could travel from a dungeon to the real world, the skeleton version of exp could not. Since all the skeletons were level 4 in the dungeon, which was currently their max level, it would be wasted. Well, if I need dark, maybe I'll bring it in. It has its own mission in the real world after all. Blue was still in charge of the skeletons, and had already sent Lamp off to scout further ahead, following the flesh-like route along. It seemed no more enemies were coming, so the 17 Knights dead Knights must have been the whole response force, there to reinforce the Knights, and possibly repair the chopped flesh route. It would take time before another force was sent again, but that depended on how long it would take to fix the flesh route nutrient pipeline, but how much time that was. Jay couldn't be sure, but he would not be here by the time they realized. Handy's sword was getting larger and more hefty. It had also become more straight and symmetrical, compared to Jay's original design. Jay idly watched, his eyes sometimes drifting to Red's new shield by his side as he waited, the blue and white color catching his eyes. What? 2 towers. 2 lords. It was simply too vague. With a sigh, Jay gave up, ending his brainstorming session after Handy had completed its new sword, ending the crafting process with a sword grip. Handy made the grip thicker, wider and more of a rectangle shape than a round one, which would help it to keep the sword straight as it cut towards its target. The end of the sword tapered off to a perfect triangle point which was flattened on each side, so it could still effectively stab, though it would be more like a jagged cut than a puncture. Jay was ready to march, but he couldn't help but take in the grandeur of his skeletons for a moment. While the skeletons with weapons were threatening and magnificent in their own right, they now seemed like an ancient fighting force of deadly soldiers. Armored and ready to carry out their master's will, whether it be to pillage a town or assault a fortified castle. The world seemed like it was at their feet. Jay was speechless, if only for a moment. As he glanced at Blue though, the feelings faded, its armor incomplete. Still more work to do, he thought, seeing that Blue was missing a chest piece, among other things. Coincidentally, the spectral Ashen gray armor mixed well with the metal gray armor, only lacking the luster of the metal, and Jay only wanted more. The more armor we get, the more knights we can deal with too. Jay nodded approving of his skeletons, feeling content as he was ready to leave. Let's move. We have work to do. Jay ordered, and followed Handy along, Red and Blue at either side with Sweeper at the back. Some time passed as they marched, and Lamp had stopped again. As the Necromancer and his minions traveled, the terrain began to change. Less and less trees were around, while the roots climbed higher and higher up their trunks. There were some mounds of roots around now too, which Jay had guessed were trees or rocks, as he had already come across a few trees in the process of being swallowed by the undeniable roots. The innocuous roots were forming coffins, swallowing up whatever they could. This allowed Jay to see further, but removed any forms of camouflage and cover, forcing him to trace his path between the mounds of roots. Jay didn't really have to follow the large flesh-like root anymore, as all of the smaller ones had been forming a pattern, all trailing back towards the source. A castle. It was the first castle Jay had ever seen. Its smooth giant block walls looked impenetrable, able to withstand whatever was thrown at it, and standing resolutely against all time. It came complete with battlements, towers, and a large rusted gate. The roots, strangely, did not touch the walls, and instead sprung up from underneath them, not damaging them in the slightest. So the source of the roots is protected by a damn castle, because well of course it is. Jay pursed his lips. He was not expecting it to be easy, it never was. So far, Jay had only conquered a level 1 dungeon, having not yet finished the level 3 Mistkeep dungeon, although he came close, yet a part of him assumed, or perhaps knew, he would travel back to Losel and finish it. Someday. Around the base of the castle were more buildings, however they seemed more like little pebbles below the overbearing fortress. Constructed with large stone blocks, each of them were angular with smooth surfaces, as practical as they were durable. Pretty advanced at least compared to the villages, he smirked. They just need a floating gate, then I'll be impressed. Groups of knights had slowly patrolled between these buildings, and Jay noticed they were going into a particular handful of buildings, and ignoring others. What would they be doing in there? Jay wondered. Groups of 3 marched around between the buildings, though there were a few larger groups of 20 or so marching around the outermost perimeter, with another force of troops moving around in the gate entrance. Damn, pretty much locked down. It must always be like this since I didn't give up my presence. Jay continued to watch for the next hour, plotting and planning his next moves, though he could only think of one strategy: to lure them out and slowly whittle down their numbers. Classically known as guerrilla warfare. Chapter 267 Weakness. Jay was lying on a mound of roots, hiding among them as he stared at the patrolling knights, trying to find patterns as they marched around the outer settlement below the grand castle. Lou lay next to him, also taking in the sight and receiving a lesson while Jay whispered to himself, his privilege as an aspiring commander of Jay's future army. There's no way to sneak in, not with these roots covering and flattening everything, but luring them out would give away our presence. Plus, after killing a few, the intelligent ones will probably catch on quickly, and only send larger forces out. There has to be a better way than to use the skeletons to bait them out. Lou glanced at Jay, perhaps not happy that it may be pathetically used as bait, though as a commander, it would probably use such a strategy at some point. As Jay looked across the empty, root-covered land, his eyes caught a glimpse of something, and with the gaze of a predator, his lips curled into a smile. Why make a new plan, Jay thought as his eyes locked onto another pulsating root in the distance. Looking around, he soon spotted another one too. Leaving these roots everywhere, they have kinda fucked themselves. Surely they won't be surprised if I take advantage of that. He grinned. Jay first retreated further away, out of sight of the castle before marching towards the next route, while pondering about what happened the last time he cut one. I wonder if they send 17 knights next time. Was it simply random chance that they were split into manageable groups of 10 and 7? Jay wondered. For now he could only hope. If the enemy was a group of 17, Jay would have no choice but to retreat. There was a chance they would send more this time, or perhaps none at all, as 2 of their roots being cut may be too suspicious. Jay and the skeletons arrived at the pulsing root, but instead of cutting it, Jay decided to follow it, heading back into the forest. Cutting it now wouldn't lure the knights far enough. He shrugged. If the knights found the cut part of the root this close to the castle, there would of course be no need to go further, and slaying them so close to the castle would only be foolish. Plus, at the end of the route there will likely be a small group of knights to kill. Easy X. He nodded. It was a safer strategy with some benefits, but would take more time. However, if a riskier strategy failed, then Jay's time spent in this dungeon would skyrocket. Sometimes the safer way would be the fastest. Jay made it to the flesh root. It was pulsing slowly, a disgusting squelching sound as it pumped human fluids within. Lamp, again, was sent ahead as the party marched along. This route was much longer than the other one, as an hour passed before Jay sensed that Lamp stopped again, finding the end of the flesh route. The sun was already starting to go down on the second day spent in this barren dungeon, yet there was no stopping. Jay could no stop. There would be no time for rest tonight. Since the first route Jay had cut will not be fixed anytime soon, and the knights would soon catch on, it was just a matter of time before he lost the element of surprise. From the moment he cut it, he had to act as fast and decisively as possible. Jay pressed on and persevered, soon coming to another tower, standing tall over another pit. 3 knights were outside, 2 around the pit and another at the tower's entrance. The tower itself seemed to be in a much better condition than the other one Jay had seen, and oddly, there were barricades around its broken entrance. A few suits of rusted armor lay at the base, stripped off the corpses which had undoubtedly been thrown into the pit. Jay looked over the remains. A fight had happened here, probably a long time ago by the looks of it, but it seems that the parasite-infested knights won in the end. Well, there were only 3 knights. Jay had his skeletons move into position to assassinate them as covertly as possible, though Red had a special mission. Red's mission: to ignore the knight near the tower and stand its ground at the tower entrance, bolstering itself with its new shield and bracing against whatever may rush out. It was a timeless tactic Jay often employed. Lamp was the quietest skeleton of them all, not having any armor, while its bone clicks were muffled by its skin suit, so it was tasked with silencing the knight standing by the tower. As for the other 2 knights at the pit, Blue and Sweeper handled one knight, while Handy handled the other. Jay loved watching how the skeletons signaled to begin an ambush, as they did it without a sound. No one shouting attack, it simply happened. The enemy would perhaps hear the clink of a bone or the piercing ring of a sword, but it would always be too late. 115, exp 115 exp. 2 enemies dropped without a fight, the skeletons offering no hesitation. This chapter's initial release occurred on the N0vel BJJN side. Of all the skeletons, Handy's strategy seemed the most intriguing, and Jay was wanting to see its new sword in action, yet it didn't make use of it at all. Perhaps it's too honorable to use its sword for assassination. He guessed with a smile, just champion things. Instead of sullying its sword, Handy had simply ran at the knight and spear kicked it into the pit. Jay couldn't hear it struggle, and neither could he see what was happening in the pit, and Handy remained at the edge to make sure its victim died. Blue, Lamp and Sweeper rushed behind Red after loud clangs and thumps were coming from its shield. There were enemies inside the tower, but how many? Each hit sent Red backwards slightly, its bone feet scraping against the stone, but it had successfully blocked the entrance. The enemies outside were dead, the enemies inside the trap, sealed into their final resting place. Of course, they fought back with all the strength they had. With the other skeletons at Red's back, it was now braced and no longer inched backwards. Instead, together they all pushed together, forwards into the tower. A fight broke out inside, and Jay couldn't see what was happening, but unless a skeleton fell, Jay wasn't worried in the slightest. The odds are in their favor anyway. The knights won't make good fighters in such a tight area, plus, they can't make it past Red. Red remained at the entrance while the other skeletons caused havoc inside the tower. Rings of swords, thuds of steel and falling armor, soon sounded while Jay confidently emerged from the cover of the forest, the perpetrator of all this death. Jay walked to Handy's side and watched from the edge of the pit. The soldier it kicked in had been consumed, swallowed whole by one of the flesh-like flowers, so it was just a matter of time before it died. Jay glanced at the tower next, and its sounds of fighting grew quieter as the enemies within were slain. 115, exp 115, exp 115 exp. The skeletons were ascending the stairs now, but Jay decided to wait outside and simply see what they would bring back. Chapter 268, The Crucible Experiment. Jay stood with Red at the entrance of the tower, waiting for his skeletons to clear out the inside. A few moments passed and no exp notifications came through, and soon enough the skeletons returned. Alright, let's get this root cut, it won't cut itself. Jay turned as the skeletons came out. Blue was the last exit, and instead of helping to cut the root, it presented something to Jay. Oh, Jay was surprised, as he had told the skeletons to take whatever they wanted for themselves. Blue held out a tattered-looking diary. Its original leather bindings did not do well at withstanding the test of time, and only a few pages had survived, as they were coated with a waxy substance. "Where did you find this?" Jay said, flipping through the worn-out tattered pages. Blue simply pointed its sword up to the top of the tower. "Nice work." Jay nodded at Blue. Blue bowed respectfully, and then went to help with cutting the root. It had since found its own chest plate of armor, and started to make a few clinking sounds as it moved too. At this point its armor suit was more complete than Red's, though Red carried the shield. In the meantime, the knight which was pushed into the pit had died too, giving Jay some more exp before he entered the tower. 115 exp. Red, let's go, Jay said, and Red went in front of Jay, leading him to the top of the tower. Jay was getting quite accustomed to not going first and giving orders, instead of doing tasks himself. This particular tower was in much better condition, and its internal wooden stairs were supported by various stone blocks, making the climb to the top as uneventful as it was safe. Looking around, Jay found the place Blue had grabbed the diary from. A corpse, well, a skeleton as it was fleshless. Nice coat, Jay remarked. The skeleton wore a white coat of some sort, and Jay guessed they must have been quite rich to have such a pristinely white piece of clothing. Dead for some time, its bones were clean of flesh, and it was lying against a wall with an empty glass vial loosely clasped in its hand. It was obvious to Jay how it died. Seems like a better fate than what's out there. Jay frowned. Another part of the room had a table with some scraps of paper and some odd instruments, which seemed to be similar to butcher and blacksmith tools except much smaller. Jay scratched his finger across a rusty spoon, but decided not to take any of them with him. There was a dark pile of mush covered with a coating of green mold, which Jay guessed was once a food pile, as next to it was a large cauldron with black stagnant water at the very bottom. Jay decided to search the pockets of the white coat, and found a strange needle-like dagger which Jay guessed was a sort of letter opener. I wonder what they were doing here. No weapons, in a tower surrounded by knights, why leave the castle? Another pocket contained a strange flat rope tied around a teardrop-shaped object which was like a squishy sort of wood, or perhaps a sort of mineral-filled sponge. This chapter's initial release occurred on the N0VLBJJN site. Very odd. Jay squinted at it as he squeezed it gently. Analyzing it offered no clues, and he guessed it was a necklace of sorts. Perhaps an amulet, or perhaps it was nothing more than trash. Jay stashed it in his bag along with his black cube, which he had been carrying this whole time. Is it bigger? He thought, looking at the cube in the bottom of his bag. Surely not. He shook his head, closing it as he put the bag back on. Jay headed back down the tower. He would have liked to rest, but how he spent his next 10 hours was crucial as the knights would be on the move. As he exited the tower, the skeletons were still chopping the root, so Jay pulled out his chair and sat down, deciding to finally read the diary that Blue had brought him. Of all the pages this diary contained, only the waxy pages had survived the test of time. The results were promising, too promising to keep from prying eyes. Some corrupt fucker took an egg with him, and some serum. I bet it was Anderson, but it doesn't matter now. One egg was all it fucking took. We went too far, we cut corners, we let this happen. Our desire to live has led to our destruction. There is no future for humans anymore, probably not even humankind. They escaped and spread too quickly. I locked myself in the compound while my colleagues were taking their turn. After my food ran out, I left the safe room. Nothing but empty rooms, flip desks and papers strewn everywhere. It was empty, gutted of life. The emergency lighting barely lit the hallways after weeks had passed. Somehow I made it to the portal. Now the only safe place left is here, inside the experiment of all places in this damned crucible. The experiment continues, not that they know it. But I won't warn them. All of their fates are sealed anyway now, many of them are turning too. The fruits aren't growing anymore either, so there's nothing to stop them. Yeah, fuck Anderson. Jay chuckled, not knowing any other details about this person. Alright, so the fruit is meant to stop them being the parasites most likely, as he referred to eggs, but this is basically saying that this is one big experiment. This whole valley enclosed by cliffs. Jay shook his head in amazement. Red shield seemed to make sense, at least the part of its design with the brown jagged outside did. It was the cliffs surrounding them. A part of Jay was jealous, and to do experiments of such a grand scale was now subconsciously added onto his list of priorities. But how does this tie into my quest? Who is innocent? Who is untainted? He wondered, not only in this dungeon, but the real world too. Being tainted doesn't mean you are infected either. I wonder if it has something to do with innocence. But innocent of what? Jay took out the needle of hunger and gazed closed at it. Maybe these are two separate ideas that I'm just trying to force together. Maybe the needle is just to help me figure something else out. Needle of hunger. He scratched his chin. Hunger for what? Food. It can't be that simple. Blood. Revenge, war. Lust. Well, if it was a hunger to murder, then sure, you could say they aren't exactly innocent, at least their thoughts aren't. Our desire to live has led to our destruction. Could it be a hunger for immortality? Do the innocent not hunger though? He pondered. It surely can't just be hunger for food though, as it tells me people are tainted by something, even myself, even after I fill my belly with food. Jay sat silently for a moment, letting his thoughts mix and sink in, while the skeletons diligently hacked away at the writhing root. Much of the green fluid had since poured out and filled some of the pit below. Finally the root separated. Jay stashed his chair away, and the group began to march back towards the castle. Lamp was sent further ahead, much further this time, as it would give Jay enough time to prepare an ambush for whatever response force may come. As Jay walked, he felt like he was about halfway back, yet there were no signs of any knights coming. Something about it was unnerving. No response force. It didn't make sense. It was eerily silent. The only sounds were the marching of his bone soldiers, and at this point Jay actually preferred the enemies to send something than nothing at all. Chapter 269 The Subterfuge Rally. Jay marched all the way back to the castle, thinking that he may have been walking right into an ambush. However, Lamp, Jay's forward scout, was fine thus far, and the only thing the knights knew were that 2 roots had been cut. Safely, the party eventually arrived at the mounds of roots near the castle, and he soon found out why there was no response force. An army was gathering, its size growing larger with each passing second. Yet Jay still sensed some more opportunity to be taken advantage of, and he wasn't going to let it slip. By now they have probably sent another small force to investigate the first cut route, so why don't we have a little look? Jay smiled. He and the skeletons marched back towards where the first flesh route met the mounds of roots near the castle, and sent Lamp into the forest, before giving out some orders. Blue, if Lamp finds some easy kills out there, take all the skeletons with you to slay them, except for Red, of course. The initial posting of this chapter occurred via N0V3LB11N. Blue nodded, and waited alongside Jay and Red. It didn't take long, not even 30 minutes had passed, and suddenly the skeletons sprinted off into the forest. Watching them leave, Jay couldn't help but feel like he knew the enemy better than it knew itself, as he had accurately predicted another scouting party being sent this way. Seems like I just bought myself some more time. Jay smiled. 460 X. The small scouting force was easily destroyed, while Jay didn't even have to lift a finger, and it seemed that the enemy had underestimated Jay. Of course, this scouting force was sent out before the second route was cut, so it was much smaller than it should have been. While Jay waited for the skeletons to get back, he kept his eyes facing towards the castle, as the knights had reacted strongly to the second route being cut. Finally, it seemed like they were shaken into action. By the time the skeletons returned, a large assembly of knights were gathered at the front of the castle, and in an organized formation. It was too far away to count exactly how many there were, but Jay guessed there to be well over 50 knights. We should move, Jay whispered, and Blue got the skeletons ready. Without giving the enemy any more time, Jay sneaked off with the skeletons through the mounds of roots, finding another position to lay on, further away from the dead flesh root pipeline. Just in time. Jay smiled, seeing the small army of knights began to march. If he didn't move his position, they would have marched right over him. The castle had acted. The knight army had split into 2 as they went further from the castle, approximately 30 to 40 soldiers in each, as they marched directly towards the 2 cut routes. It was no wonder the villagers had to submit to this many knights. Now there was not much time left. Jay lay prone on a root mound and wondered what he would do next, while watching the army of knights leaving. Their numbers were much more than he had expected, but it showed they were starting to take the flesh root sabotage seriously. While 1 root going down may have simply been a falling tree, 2 was cause for alarm. Still, there was no word about the situation of the first root either. No scouts had ever returned. Now, no more small groups of fixers and scouts would be sent, only a considerable force of soldiers. There were so many hiding in the castle. I wonder how many more I can get to come. Jay smiled mischievously as he sent the skeletons away to perform some secret missions. The knight army was relatively slow-moving, compared to the smaller groups they had sent. Each of them marched much more slowly, not only to maintain the formation, but to respond to sudden threats. Jay didn't even entertain the idea of trying to fight such a large force. It would be nothing short of suicide. For now he watched and waited as the skeletons got into position, carrying out his machinations. Blue, give the signal as soon as the large forces of knights enter the forest. All this time, Jay had been watching the castle gates, guessing how many knights were still hidden inside, and he would soon have a good guess after his plan was carried out. Not only that, but the gate itself caused him to wonder, is it still functional? Finally, the 2 large groups of knights disappeared into the forest, and the signal was given. Jay's plan was put into effect as each of the skeletons positioned themselves above more of the pulsating flesh-like roots, all desperately carrying nutrients back into castle. Red tapped Jay's shoulder, telling him that the skeletons were going forward with the plan. In almost perfect sync, they brought down their swords onto the defenseless roots, and Jay couldn't wait to see the reaction of the remaining knights in and around the castle. There were some still patrolling among the buildings outside the castle. In groups of 3, they seemed to follow more structured paths now, while before it seemed more random. Yet as the flesh roots were all punctured simultaneously, they all paused as if in shock. 4 roots were being hacked apart mercilessly, and the knights all moved frantically, creating new forces as quickly as they could. Idiots, Jay scorned, watching them with glee as his plan was coming to fruition. He didn't know how important these nutrient-carrying roots were to the knights, but based on their reaction, they were very important. Knights sprinted out of the castle gates, many of them being of the intelligent variety. Yet there were really not many left. 4 roots cut meant 4 groups had to be created, each of them being approximately 5 to 6 knights strong. However, they wouldn't need to travel far to find that the cut flesh roots were just out of sight of the castle, and much closer compared to the other times Jay had cut the roots. Essentially, there was not much time. Jay's second part of the plan was about to start, and it was the most risky too. While the knights were assembling into whatever groups they could, the skeletons were sprinting back to Jay. Once the skeletons were all gathered, Jay simply waited until the perfect moment. Soon enough, the perfect moment presented itself as the 4 small groups of knights each started their march towards the 4 freshly cut flesh roots. This plan was the most dangerous Jay had devised so far, and it was a one-way ticket, but Jay believed he would be able to pull it off, as the knights really were not that smart. At least not strategically intelligent anyway. All this time, they had only dealt with pathetic starving. The skeletons had returned, covering Jay's back as he crept forward towards the castle as quickly and quietly as he could. Soon he was closer than the 4 groups of knights which had just left, and that was when he broke cover and bolted in an all-out sprint. With the skeletons at his side, Jay madly dashed towards the castle gateway. Chapter 270 Breach. The last light of day sluggishly died out as a covert assault force advanced on the parasite-controlled castle. This chapter's initial release occurred on the N0vel BJJN side. Jay dashed across the lifeless, root-covered ground as swiftly as his legs could move him. It wasn't long before he started passing the strange buildings which were planted around the base of the castle. As he ran past, he peered into them, glimpsing what seemed to be the familiar green fluids filling small basins. However, there was no time to investigate, as the knights had noticed his presence here. A patrol of 3 knights had caught sight of him and his band of skeletons. 2 were in pursuit, sprinting towards Jay, but the 3rd had disappeared to find backup. Jay didn't send the skeletons back to deal with the pursuers, as he didn't know what lay deeper within the castle. An army of 80 knights had left, followed by about 20 more to investigate the broken flesh roots. But he didn't think the enemy was foolish enough to send every single one of its troops out. The grand castle seemed to tower over him as he drew nearer. Jay looked up as he ran under the giant iron gate, noticing it was much more rusted than the knight's armor could ever hope to be, covered in a thick red layer. Through the darkness of the castle gate was an inner courtyard. Various passageways led deeper into the castle, but Jay had to ignore them for now, as there was no time to investigate. Hold them off here. Jay commanded the skeletons, and each of them lined up just behind the giant gate. 2 towers made up each side of the gatehouse, each of them having stone archways for entries. As Jay's eyes locked onto them, he sent Red in first, as he wasn't sure if the knights could see in the darkness. The spiral stairway twisted right as it ascended upwards into the tower, yet the sounds of fighting were already echoing from the skeletons below. 230 X. The 2 knights which had chased them had died, but the sounds of swords clashing had drawn out more enemies from the depths of the castle. Jay decided not to pull out his luminous orb, as he would reach the gatehouse soon, and if there were any windows or openings, then it would become like a beacon in the night, drawing all knights far and wide. Red's bone footsteps clinked as they scurried up the stone steps, its armor resembling the sounds of the knights. There were no sounds of fighting above, and Jay assured himself. Jay's eyes adjusted to the darkness as he climbed to the top of the stairs. Faint shafts of light came in through arrow slits in the gatehouse's wall, helping him to see the vague outline of the gate mechanism. Large rusted chains connected to a drum winch held the gate up, a circular drum with large wooden pegs. Jay looked around for a way to drop the gate, but in the darkened room, nothing stood out. Damn it. Come on. He searched around the room, but that was when Red came over and touched his shoulder, beckoning him to one of the arrow slits. Jay shot towards the wall, peering below the castle. Fuck. A large group of knights was charging forwards, much more than his remaining skeletons could handle. The skeletons were already fighting enemies running out of the castle, so if enemies were on their backs, their fight would end soon. Damn it. Jay pursed his lips. Turning around, he pulled out his luminous orb. Its glowing light didn't matter anymore, as all the knights knew he was here. The gate room had a few different hatches in the floor, designed for guards to drop large rocks onto enemies below. Among large boxes of rocks were cauldrons, filled with oil which was boiled and poured down the hatches during an attack, however it was cold right now. The gate mechanism revealed itself under the light. 2 latches on either side had to be pulled to release the gate and let it drop. Red. The latch. Jay pointed. His words were level but urgent, hiding the stress he felt. Red grabbed the latch and glanced at Jay. 3, 2, 1. GRR crack. The latches pulled back at the same time as the gate's chains rattled, however, after a grinding sound, nothing happened. Below the gate, it was too late. The additional force of the knights crashed into the skeletons, and one of them died. Your skeleton has been slain. Jay peered into the enclosure and saw that his fear had come true. The rest of the gate caused it to jam on its guide rails as it fell. Shit. Think. Jay looked through the room for anything to help him, and his eyes landed on the defensive weapons. Red, help me with the cauldron, Jay said, running behind a cauldron and pushing. The giant cauldrons were heavier than they seemed, and it slowly moved, grinding across the floor, yet with Red, it was possible to flip it to his side. Red and Jay hurled it over towards the gate enclosure and, without hesitation, pushed it down. Boom. GRR. The cauldron landed with a heavy boom, shaking the gate as it ground down further, but it just wasn't enough. The skeletons below wouldn't last much longer. If they fell, the large swarm of knights would push through the gate. It would be a matter of time before they found and killed Jay. For now, it locked the skeletons in a triangle formation. Having copied the tactics of the knight they had slain in the forest, they braced themselves and covered each other's backs, but the damage was still mounting. The gate needed to fall before the skeletons did. Red had already rushed over to the next cauldron and gazed at its master, waiting for him to come over and help it push. However, Jay stood there, looking down into the gate enclosure, and seeing his loyal skeletons still fighting below, he smiled. At this moment, they filled him with such pride, they were fighting for him. Red banged its shield against the cauldron, trying to get Jay's attention, but Jay stood there, shaking his head with a smile. Something had appeared in Jay's hand, a pale, fluid-filled crystal. Seems like I'll need to use one of these. I always thought I'd be throwing it at a monster. The author's note. Sorry for no chapters these last few days, I have been very sick.